welcome everyone to this webinar. Here is today's agenda. We'll start with an introduction. Marlene Petsch from the ERAA steering group will give a short introduction of the ERAA, presenting also the timeline. And then I will also make a recap from the previous workshop and what was discussed there. We'll give the floor to Acer and Daniel to present Acer's focus for this ERAA and their viewpoint on the methodological progress. And then we will move to the methodology, so the technical part of the presentations. We'll have a session there on the economic viability. This will be presented by Felix. We'll have an update on how we model energy islands. Antonio is with us to give the presentation on this part. We'll have a break of 5 minutes at that point, so that people can have a glass of water, but also write their questions in the Slido platform. And then we'll continue with the part 2, which is methodologies more related to the network representation with Lucas Galdikas, and flow factor competition and curtailment sharing, where Zakaria will give a presentation. At the end of this technical part, we'll have a Q&A. Considering the questions that we received in the previous workshop, we anticipated even a longer slot for questions this time, and I think we'll have enough time to have good discussions at the end of the presentations. After that, of course, we'll have some closing remarks, and we'll close the meeting, the webinar. By this, I then give the floor to Marlene Petsch to already start with the introduction. Thanks, Marlene.
Thank you, Lazarus. Welcome and good morning from my side. I'm pleased to have you with us on board for this methodological webinar number 2. And I would like to enter my short presentation with a short recap on the ERAA itself. So basically the background, what the European Resource Adequacy Assessment stands for. It's an ENTSO-E legal mandate following Article 23 of the Electricity Regulation, with the aim to identify resource adequacy concerns by performing adequacy assessments of the current electricity system to supply projected demands. Projected demands in itself is one of the main inputs of our calculation parameters, and will have in the next few years quite some components which we need to take into account in terms of electrification and flexibility. So quite a huge attention point also on this side. It is a full pan-European monitoring assessment of the system resource adequacy, unique of its kind, and it's based on state-of-the-art probabilistic analysis. This probabilistic analysis, we try to take into account stochastic uncertainty, which results from renewable generation, but also temperature dependency on the demand side, which becomes way more important. And the whole assessment itself looks up into 1 decade ahead, so up the next 10 years to come. We follow a stepwise implementation of the methodology. As many of you know, this methodology was drafted back in the years 19 and 20, and within the process of ERAA 2021, we start to basically follow, and with every year improve the methodology, improve our assessment following the guidance given by the methodology. So you know the assessment 21 and 2022 are out. We also link them here in the slides for you to follow. The ERAA process of this year aims to be an effective tool to identify adequacy risks. It already includes an enhanced economic viability assessment, and we follow a flow-based market coupling approach, which is incorporated in the central reference scenarios. So for the core region, we cover the whole perimeter by a flow-based approach, which takes into account the development of the grid of the future. And by proactively and factually identifying the system adequacy challenges, the ERAA shall support decision makers in ensuring a secure, affordable, and sustainable energy amount to citizens and industries. Next slide, Lazarus. I would shortly today recap the work which we did in these recent weeks and months. As many of you know, we had a non-approval of the ERAA 2022, also 21, with some red flags raised by Acer, which we seriously took up in order to enhance this year's product to be ready for some successful ERAA approval of 2023. So I list today the points where we really put focus on within the recent weeks and months. So the first one was the Fit for 55 target not to be met with our scenarios. So it's a member state's responsibility to deliver the input we will put into our models. The TSO is the one who is transferring this information towards the European process. And we aim for a really strong cooperation between member states, TSOs, and regulators so that we have the best available input data at the time being. We also performed the public consultation and increased the communication towards the outside on this matter. And we should meet the purpose for a risk assessment with robust input data. So basically what we gathered for this year's process, we state that this is well aligned with all countries, member states, regulators, and TSOs cooperation. So the second bullet, which was raised, was the representation of the interconnectors and also the 70% rule all over the period, which was not always met, but also by the fact that we followed an NTC approach with the core region being represented by a flow-based representation of the grid. And therefore, in some moments, the 70% rule was not met within the processes of the past. What we also had to develop on was to take into account the network representation of the future. So we had one existing grid model for 2025 available, but we now already tackle target years up until the year 2033. And therefore we needed to invest in an approach to take into account the grid expansion for the years up until 2033. And the last bullet, which was a very big one, where we had to take various steps on improvements, was the consistency between these two models. We are not at an integrated model between the EVA part and the economic dispatch part. And therefore, we had some bullets where we needed to take actions on, which was the first one, the recalibration of the climate years weighting factors in the EVA, which is based on LOLE, following an approach where we had also aligned on with ACER. We have a cross-border representation in EVA, which is not yet flow-based, but it's not only pure NTC as delivered by the TSOs. And this approach we basically follow by applying some additional constraints, which we add to the EVA part of the model. And the last very intensive point where we took actions was the curtailment sharing algorithm. So basically, after the flow-based calculation is performed, we apply some corrections on the results which we retrieve following the curtailment sharing and local matching approach. And therefore, we will have quite some insights today later in the presentation. And with that, I now will take the last slide, Lazarus, which is the timeline for this year's process. So we started data collection with the beginning of this year. So as of January, we had really data delivered by TSOs, validated and cross-checked, and model building started in May. So in the last 2 months, the colleagues were really busy on creating the model. On the one hand side, the adequacy model, but also the EVA part, which is currently on the way to be finalized in order to trigger the calculations within the next days. So the summer period will focus on simulations, executing, extracting results, and performing analysis on that. In parallel, the report drafting is happening. So over this whole period, the orange bar which you see is really the paperwork which needs to be done. Over this period of time, we had the first methodological webinar in the mid of June. Today we are on the second part of this methodological webinar, and we will talk to you after we retrieve our final results by a webinar which will be dedicated towards results and the outcome. And by the time being, we still hope for a publication by the end of November. So basically, we are all putting energy over the summer to be ready in the period of November to be with you and provide you with the insights and publish the ERAA 2023 report. Thanks for attention, and now I hand back to Lazarus.
Thanks, Marlene, for this introduction. To complete the introduction, I want to remind the audience of the topics that we discussed in the first part of this a series of workshops. So we had a session early this month where we discussed the feedback from the call for evidence. We also discussed the price cap evolution and the methodology to calculate the new price caps. There was a question on this topic, a request actually to share the values. So this is also streamlined, and it will be published in the coming days or couple of weeks, together with the post-consultation data. We discussed explicit DSR modeling and the expansion potential. And then we had some presentations on the adequacy models and how we optimize maintenance was one big topic, and reserve modeling. So we already had these detailed discussions. We answered questions, but there were some questions that we didn't manage to tackle on time. You can see here the remaining questions. These were also relevant more to topics that were not discussed in the first part. So would like to just say here that we didn't forget about these questions. They will be covered in today's presentations, and they are mostly relevant, as you see here, to the part that Felix will be presenting, which is the economic viability assessment, but also relevant to the flow-based presentation that Lucas will include in the network representation part. We also had a poll during the previous webinar. What was the most important methodological element for the audience? Then stochastic EVA seemed to be a very important step of progress in the economic viability improvements. While ERAA seems to be important for most of the users, as they look into the midterm scenarios and they are interested in those scenarios. So also the results of the EVA. With this short recap, I will just give the floor actually to Daniel from Acer to start with Acer's view and complete actually the picture on the discussions between ENTSO-E and Acer, and then we'll continue with the technical topics in the second part. So Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lazaros. So hello everyone. I'm Daniel from Acer. Acer is the EU agency for the cooperation of energy regulators. We work with the national regulators on topics related to the internal energy market. And one of the topics is security of supply, and in particular ERAA, which Acer approves every year. Now, I confirm what Marlene said, that we have been in close interaction and cooperation over the past few months to see how and what can be improved for this year's ERAA to strengthen the robustness of the results. And we did achieve a lot of progress so far. In my presentation, I will focus on, if you remember, Marlene had 3 bubbles, and it was Fit for 55, so consistency with the climate goals, and then there was the 70%, and on the right the consistent application and implementation of the models. I will focus on that and give you a little bit of background of the thinking. So consistency is Acer's main focus this year, and to understand that, this slides is meant to represent the way ERAA is implemented for the time being, and it's implemented with 2 modules. So on the left you see the economic viability assessment part, which calculates investments, entries, and exits, and on the right the economic dispatch will give the risks that the system sees. And together they work and give the final results. Now, the result of having 2 modules of the ERA is that you always have to be very conscious on how you apply different assumptions and inputs in the two parts so that they work together well and they are consistent. This is this problem arises because of the particular implementation. Say if we had a single module, we didn't have that, but due to technical reasons, complexity, and so on, the current implementation is such. So this is just to give the background, and we can go to the next slide. Indeed. So say if assumptions and different implementation choices diverge between the two, it will have an immediate impact on the results. So the scales meant to show that. So this is our focus this year. This is the discussions with the ENTSO-E we had to improve the consistency, to have the scales in balance. So whatever you put in the economic viability, you have to have a consistent reflection of it in the economic dispatch. And I will bring you two examples. So we can go to the next slides. And these were also on Marlene's slide, the same with the three bubble. You maybe remember the cross-zonal bullet point. So it's this. What we have seen in previous eras is that the interconnector development, which is reflected in the TYNDP network development plan, was unevenly implemented in the two modules of ERA. So we saw the network development reflected in the investment module, but in the adequacy module, it was not symmetrically reflected. So one of the discussions, and this is example one, was how to rebalance that. So we see the network development symmetrically in the two modules. That's example one, and I have one more example, and that would be it for me. Next one is with the climatic variables, the so-called climate years. Again, two modules and a diverging implementation due to complexity reasons, due to practical reasons, say, in the investment module, a subset of the full climate year set is implemented, which for Acer is acceptable in this implementation phase. However, our discussions were towards how to improve the selection of those climate years for the investment module. So out of the bigger set, which is 35 years for the adequacy module, which represents all different kinds of situations that over the climate years, the heat waves and the cold spells and so on, how to reflect that variability, which will of course have an impact on the revenues that especially the marginal plants see. So say when it's very cold or it's very, very hot. So how that impact can be symmetrically, consistently reflected in the investment module with a subset of climate years. So the discussions were around that, and we feel that we have found a way forward to make an improvement on that aspect. Again, having an impact on the overall consistency of the implementation, which again was Acer's priority this year. So two examples for this quest to improve consistency. Again, we had very good discussions over the past 6 months with ENTSO-E, and we are looking forward to see the results of ERAA in the fall. With that, I will pass back the word to you, Lazarus.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Thanks for the presentation. I think we can actually pause at this point to see whether there are any questions to the first speaker, so to Daniel and Marlene in this introduction. I'm checking Slido. I don't see any questions for the moment. Okay, then in that case, I propose that we don't lose time since we have another Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So I think we can continue. We can already start with the technical presentations, and then we can take all questions at the end. I see already a question, but it's actually technical, so I would like to keep it for the Q&A. So thanks a lot to the speakers of the first part, and then I will give the floor to Felix Boeing. Felix is a member of the ERAA market study team and will be presenting the economic viability assessment topics. Felix, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Lazarus. So yeah, as I've seen, EVA is a very interesting topic for most of the stakeholders. So I'm very happy to present you the steps we made forward in this year's version of ERAA. And basically on the first slide, I will just jump into it and present you the EVA methodology in a nutshell. So the key parts of EVA economic viability assessment. We follow the approach of a pan-European generation and storage portfolio optimization over the horizon based on a total system cost minimization approach. As you might know, in the methodology by regulation, there are two different approaches possible. We are using the overall system cost minimization approach. So it's a endogenous modeled investment decision model. We include the foresight for subsequent years in one model run. So this is not a myopic model. This means we have a multi-year investment decision. What this means in detail will come on the following slides. The decisions we model in terms of investment and disinvestment are decommissioning, lifetime extension, mothballing and demothballing of all thermal power plant types. And for expansion, it's commissioning of gas units, DSR and battery storages. I think this is quite the same as we did last year. If you need any more information regarding these investment decisions, I think the ERAA report from last year can give you some guideline on that. Regarding price cap evolution, the first webinar this year already tackled this. So I will just go very briefly into it. It's based on the ERAA 22 methodology. It's recalculated based on the new regulation and the ERAA 22 price time series, which lead to values as stated here. Also a detailed material regarding this will follow in the next weeks, as already mentioned by Lazarus. So the very interesting from modeling perspective part of the EVA is that it's a stochastic multi-year. So we have in the ERAA 22 and 23, we have 3 different climatic years that are modeled simultaneously in one optimization run. And this will lead me to the next slide where I will briefly describe a bit what means investment modeling, how is it done multi-year, and after that I will also come to the representation of different climate years in one optimization model. So first of all, I think regarding investment decisions, it's very important to know that we model multi-year investment decisions. And these kind of investment decisions usually can be very well been visualized based on these cash flow diagrams, and I will just describe as an example these different types of investment and disinvestment decisions that are part of our EVA model. First of all, for example, Unit A, an entry and life extension decision is usually being done based with high capex in the first year. We run this capex on an annuity based. So in the end, what the model sees is capex and investment decision as an annuity in every year when this unit is in place in the system. On the other side, we have fixed operation and maintenance, variable operation and maintenance, and the revenues of this unit. And as you can see, for example, I think that's very basic. Unit A is a typical investment. After that, you have the operation and maintenance costs and the revenues. And it's a equilibrium model, so in the end, it ends up to 0. Unit B is an example for some mothballing, a bit more complex. As you can see right here, the revenues are not as high as the costs, so it makes sense for the optimizer to mothball it. And there are some costs for mothballing it, and the fixed operation and maintenance costs are reduced during the times of when the unit is not in the system. After that, the revenues increase back. For example, a unit that is being demothballed after a coal exit, for example, would make sense in 2030 to come back to the market, have higher revenues because there are more scarcity situations, more peaking units are needed. And as you can see here, this is a typical way of mothballing is being done in terms of cash flows. Unit C is also very simple example. It's just exit decisions. Revenues are decreasing, and in the end, it makes sense to end the lifetime of this unit. The whole discounting has been based on a discount rate, on a WACC coming from the CONI studies, and technology-specific hurdle premium. Technology-specific hurdle premium means, and this is also described in last year's report, that, for example, it's technology dependent because there are some investments, for example, in peaking units, which have a higher uncertainty, and therefore the hurdle premium is reflecting this uncertainty. I think this is more or less some basics. So when we then just follow on the next slide is what is new in this year's EVA is that we are not modeling gap years anymore. As you might remember, last year we did the rolling approach with 3 and 2 years, and we modeled every gap year. Now we are just considering the target years of our temporal horizon. The benefit is that we have a longer temporal horizon within one investment run. And the new thing, more or less, is that the temporal distance, so for example, temporal distance between 2025 and 2028, 2 years in between, is considered in terms of cost revenue scaling and discounting of the cash flows. So in the end, we are not expanding our model with artificial gap years, just the target years are modeled, but the discounting of cash flows has been done model endogenously. So far I think that's what is new in terms of gap year, not modeling, so to speak. So let's jump to the next step, to the stochastic EVA. As mentioned in the beginning, we have 3 different climatic years, and this was also the case in year 2022. And these climatic years have been selected based on a clustering approach. This clustering approach is also described in last year's report. Basically, what has been done is that we calculated expansion parks, expansion fleets for all the different climatic years, which are part of our whole climatic selection, so 35 climatic years. And then we checked how good these expansion plans fit into other climatic years. And the distance of costs between these two, between the expansion plans in the different climatic years, was the basis on which we did the climate year clustering. And these selected climate years and the clustering stays the same, but what already was mentioned by Isir, we've seen that the weighting of the different climate years. So in the end, how much cost representative these climatic years are has led to a divergence between the EVA and the economic dispatch step. I will explain it also in the end a bit more detailed. But the big news is that we adjusted these weights in order to get a higher consistency between the EVA and economic dispatch step. What you can see here in the visualization is that we are having overall a 4 target year model with the different target years and 3 climatic years. And these climatic years are being weighted based on what we think is the best representation of scarcity situations overall and over our whole European system. And as you might imagine, this is a quite challenging approach. In the end, it's always a trade-off between having as much scarcity or as much simulation hours as possible in the model in order to have the best representation of the 35 climatic years, which are in our economic dispatch, and of course, simulation time. So in the end, we are limited to what is possible in terms of hardware and software restrictions. And therefore, we are trying to achieve having these 4 target years run within one indigenous model and this 3 climatic years. So overall, 12 times 8,760 hours. And this is challenging, and therefore we are trying to apply different aggregation methods and some solving strategies. And on the next slide, I will just describe you 3 of these different approaches that we tested over the last weeks. So that's also on the next slide. Thanks. There are 3 different options available. The first one is the rolling horizon approach, which can be done in 3 steps or 2 steps. And I think it's very close to what we did last year, but with a big news that we are running it this time with just the target years, and therefore we are quite optimistic that this year we can handle it in a 2-step way. But as already mentioned, we are just in the beginning of the simulation phase. So there are tests running, and we are trying to get our machines to the maximum in terms of memory usage, and therefore at the moment it looks like that a 2-step approach could work. Another approach that is being tested is the hourly sampling. So as you might remember last year, we calculated not on a completely full chronology hourly basis, we reduced the temporal chronology in terms of sampling. And this has been done that we've chosen 18 blocks per day. So 24 hours per day have been reduced to 18. As you can see, this is an option how, for example, in terms of revenues and costs, not super interesting hours that are close to each other can be reduced into one weighted block. And this is a way to also to reduce the model size. Another approach that is investigated, and it is new this year, is the daily sampling. So that basically a day that it is very comparable to another is being sampled into one and weighted factor 2 times, for example, if 2 days are being sampled. And this is especially in terms of scarcity situation representation very interesting because, as you might know, the demand, for example, on a weekend is quite low and therefore not driving much revenues for peaking units, for example, and therefore it's quite doable to sample, for example, weekend days, or on the other side during the summertime. It's also quite warm, and there are not many units available, and therefore also not very interesting or representative in terms of costs and revenues. So during summertime, there's also a lot of days that can be sampled and weighted higher in the end. And so these approaches we are applying at the moment. We are testing. So in the end, there will be definitely one approach being in place to reduce the runtime and the memory of the model. And our main goal is to check the consistency between EVA and economic dispatch, and also to run with smaller tests to find a sampling or a reduction method that is representing all the scarcity situations as well as possible. So to finalize on the next slide, the overall methodology stays with the system cost minimization approach. This is the central modeling principle. The cost revenue balancing approach, the alternative, is in the end leading to, if it's being perfectly done, with a lot more steps to the same result. So therefore, we are still following this cost minimization approach. The adequacy relevant disinvestment decisions are all modeled endogenously in one EVA step. Skipping the gap years allows us to include a larger temporal horizon, which is very good in one optimization run. So if it works as planned, we have 8 years or 10 years foresight in our investment decisions. And the work in progress is reducing the model size without losing accuracy. So this is being tested, and the one which has the highest accuracy is being chosen in the end. And the harmonization of the scarcity situation representation within the EVA model and the economic dispatch adequacy model, as mentioned, is the key target to have a consistency between these two steps. Because we've definitely seen also in last year's results that this is just very challenging, especially for a pan-European system. And investment modeling basically is limited due to the hardware we have available. And in the end, the challenge is to bring these 24 million hours, which are in the overall adequacy step. So 4 target years, 700 Monte Carlo years times 8,760 hours compared to what is doable in an EVA model, which is around basically 100,000 hours in one simulation run. So basically that's it. I'm happy to answer your questions afterwards. So please use Slido, and I will hand over back to Lazarus.
Thanks a lot, Felix, for the insightful presentation. We already received quite a few questions in Slido. We'll take some time. We'll give you some time also to reflect on them, and then we can start answering them during the Q&A session at the end. So thanks everyone for being active, and I would like to continue now with the next presentation and our next presenter. So Antonio Hernandez is a colleague here at ENTSO-E, expert in the market study team of ERAA, and will be presenting a new modeling element for ERAA 2023, which is the inclusion of some energy islands. So Antonio, I give the floor to you for this part of the presentation.
Thank you, Lazarus. Thank you also, Felix, for a very interesting presentation on EVA before. As already introduced by Lazarus, I'm Antonio Hernandez, energy modeler at ENTSO-E, and I will be introducing to you today the topic of energy islands. On On this brief presentation, I will start explaining one specific case of energy islands projects that are planned for the future, which is the case of Denmark. Then I will explain how we are modeling this and what are the improvements compared to last year. And finally, I will also mention the links to another project of ENTSO-E, which is the ONDP, that it's working also on the simulation of offshore infrastructure. So on this first slide, I will introduce, as mentioned, the case of Denmark. So for this slide, we don't take into account other offshore projects that are also either ongoing or planned in other countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, or Germany. The reason why we chose Denmark was that it was the first project. In 2020, the Danish Parliament decided to build 2 energy islands, one in the North Sea, another one in the Baltic Sea. And in order to facilitate the integration of wind offshore production and to serve as a hub to basically allow for a better, more efficient connection to shore of this huge wind offshore potential that we have in those 2 regions in Northern Europe. On the first one, that it's for North Sea, it's an artificial energy island that will have initially 3 gigawatts of wind energy connected to it, while the second one will also have 3 gigas. The reason why we mentioned here 3 and later on 10 is that, as also explained by Felix before, our scope or time horizon is until target year 2033. And for the energy islands of the North Sea, there are 3 gigawatts of offshore wind planned for this last target year, and these 10 gigawatts will only be installed after. Then one more point that I would like to mention on this is that these projects on the energy islands are also showing a strong TSO cooperation with already signed agreements in between Energinet and 50Hertz and Elia. And before moving to the next slide, in which I discussed the model, I would like to thank also our colleagues from Energinet for their support in the preparation of the material for this presentation today. I forgot at the start. So we can move to the next slide on the modeling. Thank you. So here I prepared 2 parts of the slide. On the left side, you can see a description of how we were doing this for ERAA 2022, and on the right side for ERAA 2023. So starting with last year, we were modeling still offshore areas, but they were modeled radially connected to shore. And we had dedicated wind generation profiles for these offshore plants. Basically, yeah, I guess most of our attendees today are aware that the generation patterns offshore can diverge both in terms of the amount of energy, but also in terms of the shape of these patterns. And for this year, we continue doing dedicated modeling of the generation of offshore power plants. But on top of that, we made an extra effort on data collection and on the communication among the relevant TSOs in the areas in order to assess what are the planned installed capacities when it comes to the interconnection in between the offshore areas themselves. One of the examples that you can see in the image to the right is that, for example, the lowest point in which represents Belgium will have its own offshore area that will be connected to not only to Belgium radially, as we were modeling last year, but also to the UK in this case, and also to the North Sea energy island of Denmark. So this is definitely an improvement in how we are modeling the offshore infrastructure. And of course, it also makes sense because now we are going beyond 2030 when this kind of projects will or are planned to be realized. And this is why we consider it relevant to implement it also for this year and improve our modeling. And then I can move to my last slide, in which I would like to mention the synergies with another project of ENTSO-E. In this case, it's the ONDP, the Offshore Network Development Plan, which we are publishing as part of the TYNDP, the 10-year Network Development Plan. Sorry. And this is to be published in 2024. The main goal of this project is to provide a high-level outlook on the development on offshore infrastructure. And of course, the report it's not yet published, also not their methodology. So I will not I cannot go in much details. But we are definitely having close interactions with our colleagues from the ONDP, especially on the input data and assumptions to make sure that that we have some consistency there. So that's all from my side. Thanks, and I will also invite everyone to ask their questions in Slido using the QR that you can see in the screen. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Antonio, for your presentation. Very interesting and new element in ERAA 2023. We invite again all the audience to put their questions, to insert their questions in Slido, and we will take them later on. I think at this point we'll have a short break before we continue with the rest of the presentations on network representation and flow-based market coupling, as well as curtailment sharing as the last part. So the hour is 10:52. I think we can restart in 5 minutes. Let's make it in fact at 11. Okay, thanks everyone, and see you back in 8 minutes. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the webinar after a short break. We can continue our technical presentations now, diving a bit into the network representation in our models and the progress that we have made for ERAA 2023 on this side. So I would like to welcome for this part Lucas Galdikas from ENTSO-E. He's an expert in our market study team and working intensively on the network representation. So Lucas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lazarus, and thank you, everyone. Can you just confirm me that you can hear me well? Great. I see a thumbs up, so I will proceed. Thank you once again. It's, of course, my pleasure to briefly address this topic today in the public webinar, and I hope that it will be very fruitful also for everyone. If that would be possible, yes, thank you very much. For the next slide. So I would like just to set the scene and to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So I have a short slide on the summary of the network representation options in our models. So on the left-hand side, you can see a net transfer capacities being used for the market coupling. And on the right-hand side, you can see alternative solution for the flow-based, domain-based market coupling representation in our models. And the main difference is that in the net transfer capacity solution, we have sort of a pipeline system where we can push electricity through any of the pipelines as we wish or in our models. And the only limiting factor is sort of a capacity set for those interconnections, and we can distribute the flows as we wish. And that's a quite convenient solution for the market models. However, of course, it has some limitations because we are establishing those transfer capacities to have sort of a confident based on confident capability for the network to accommodate those flows. Whereas if you proceed to the flow-based, domain-based market coupling solution, we can enhance the representation of the network by simply representing a little bit more of the physics into our market solutions. So in this case, a situation in one study zone, whether it would be A, B, C, we would have a clear link on how an export or import to that area would impact an element within the power system, so which we typically call it a critical network element and contingency, which is a combination of this element under a contingency. And this impact is represented by a purple dashed lines in this slide, which is quite beneficial, as we can more accurately represent network in our market simulations, and at the same time provide more let's say how to say, we could allow more market exchanges within our models. And there was one question before, just at the very introduction, when Lazarus was mentioning that there were some questions remaining from the previous presentation. And one of the questions was, can we estimate the impact of the flow-based market coupling on the adequacy for the adequacy results? And what we can definitely conclude is that by having a flow-based market coupling in our models, we proceed towards a more accurate result levels, because we can have this more accurate network representation, and we don't need to represent the interconnection capacities as these pipelines with the confident capability for the network to accommodate those flows. So we can have it a more realistic representation in our model. So the results always goes into a more accurate representation of the actual situation in the power system. Nevertheless, of course, this has some consequences, and my colleague Zakaria will be later addressing the considerations of the curtailment sharing and flow factor competition, which are being introduced by this flow-based market coupling, but I will leave for him to address this topic a little bit later. Since I hope that we are on the same page regarding the two available concepts here, in the next slide, I have just a summary of what we have in ERAA 2023 in terms of the market coupling. So it's not really that simple as it would be either one or the other solution. In our models and in Europe, we have a mix of market couplings, and it depends on the geographical region. So in the dark purple, you see a core flow-based market coupling region where we have flow-based market coupling also established in our simulations. Then in the light purple color, you see areas where the ENTSO-E-based market coupling is being used. And in the medium purple color, you see sort of a borders between those two areas where essentially the flows are limited by the net transfer capacities. However, the impact of those flows on the core region flow-based market coupling availabilities are yet assessed and being reflected for the exchanges in the core region flow-based market coupling region. So to conclude, it's really eventually a mix of various market couplings, what we are representing in our simulations, and it's not a single solution, of course, at this very moment, as we are trying to represent the actual market arrangements in our models. If you proceed to the next slide, I have just one slide on the methodology, how we derive flow-based domains from network models. It is exactly the same methodology as it was presented in ERAA 2022 webinar. If you would like to have more details, you could, of course, check that webinar material and recording as well, where we elaborated even further on. For this time, I would be very concise here, and I would say that we take in the zeros, in the gray color, of course, we take as an input data the market simulation results for the initial dispatch information. We also identify our critical network elements and the contingencies under which we monitor our network. We take this information into the network models, and we identify typical hours, typical conditions under which we can describe a network quite accurately. And this is where we stand in step 2 now, by having a very specific hour snapshots identified as the ones which we need to assess the situation in the network. Then we proceed in parallel streams, basically trying to build the flow-based domains themselves by utilizing also the remedial actions when it's needed. And said that we build the flow-based domains for those representative hours for market simulations. At the same time, in market simulations, we have many hours with varying weather conditions and varying other factors, so we need to make sure that we can map back those few flow-based domains into all market timestamps. So for this reason, we are from the clustering step, we have a determining factors identified, and we perform a classification step as number 5, where we allocate each of the typical flow-based domains to very specific time steps in our market simulation models. So this is really just a very glimpse, but for the sake of efficiency, I'm not dwelling more specifically into the methodological details of the deriving of the flow-based domains from the market, from the network models. This has been addressed already in ERAA 2022 public workshops and the publications. If you are more interested, of course, you can check that once again, including the recordings. And if there will be any follow-up questions, of course, we would be happy to address those as well. But for this moment, I would stick to the fact that the methodology is really the same as it was used in ERAA 2022. And I would ask to probably just go to the next slide, where we would be starting the discussions on the main improvements and changes compared to the ERAA 2022. And here it's exactly the same slide what was presented at the very beginning, and Marlene already showed this one. I just highlighted the two key topics which are being addressed. So first topic is accounting for the network expansions. And since in ERAA 2022, we had a single flow-based domain built for a target year 2025. This year, we want to take into account the network expansion and try to represent it in a certain extent. And the second topic is also linking EVA and economic dispatch steps more closely. So for this reason, we also link the two network representation models and try to pass the parts of the information from one model to the other one to ensure the consistency, as it was also highlighted by Daniel from Acer that this is a quite important topic. So if you proceed to the next slide, it is exactly the same information. It's just a little bit more elaborated and more specifically, the methodologies of both of these will be addressed in the following slides. Maybe more specifically speaking about the two topics. In the middle column, you can see our approach towards ERAA 2023. So to enhance the consistency between economic dispatch model, which is using the flow-based domains in the core region, and ensuring the consistency with the EVA models, which is using only the NTC data in their models. We are actually analyzing market positions in the flow-based model, in the economic dispatch model, and we are passing sort of a typical exchanges or the net positions from those simulations, and we are passing this on to the EVA model with the NTC data. In this way, we are ensuring that the market clearing using the NTC models wouldn't deviate substantially from what is expected in the economic dispatch models, where we have a flow-based market coupling being represented. And in this way, it's just a reaffirming thing that the results are more or less remains coherent. At the same time, I could mention that technically or conceptually speaking, the best solution would be to use a flow-based market coupling in all models. However, of course, we have to take into account many considerations, including the performance of the models, convergence of it, required time to execute, to run the models, and many other things. So at this point in time, we couldn't proceed in the short time frame and build EVA models with the flow-based domains, as it would complicate the models quite substantially. And therefore, for ERAA 2023, we chose the approach which I just told you about to ensure the consistency. The other topic on the network development, we are expanding flow-based domains of the 2025 target year according to the trends which we identify in the NTC submitted by the TSOs. More detailed information about the methodology itself will be addressed a little bit later. What I can mention maybe is that, again, the best solution would seem that we would need the flow-based domains for every target year when we notice a substantial network development in Europe. again, it's just a matter of the complexity of the task and how much work is needed, because even computing the flow-based domains for a single target year, it's already quite a substantial task, and expanding the work towards computing the flow-based domains for many target years, it's really a time-consuming and resource-intensive work. However, we keep it also in our radar, and this is what we see as the best solution whenever it becomes possible. So for the moment, we'll proceed with the first attempt to expand the flow-based domains according to the trends which we identified in the NTCs submitted by the TSOs. So this is a summary of the main improvements, and if we proceed to the following slides, I will be speaking more specifically about the methodology behind these improvements. If we move to the next slide, I believe we will start with the consistency enhancements. I don't know if it's actually just stuck for me or also for the others. Yes. Okay, I see now that we are moving. So indeed, we are starting with the presentation on increasing the consistency between the two models of the economic dispatch and the EVA. What I would like to say here is that it's a conceptual representation that we have as a starting point, economic dispatch model with the flow-based market coupling within it. So we have all the market clearings from there, and we can identify a range of the net positions for each study zone, in this case A, B, and C. So we have a wide range of possible scenarios when it's more stressful situation for study zone A, also when it's stressful for study zone B, and so on, and also all the situations when it's more relaxed. So we have a wide range of possible conditions, varying from very extreme when the countries need more import, and also to more relaxed when countries can rely on their domestic supply, or they can also export to the other countries, or even when they need to export to the other countries to support their adequacy. So we have this wide range for the possible scenarios, and we identify that from that range that the typical market conditions are resulting to a certain level of the of these net position limitations, and we can pass this information on top of the NTC submitted by the TSOs. So on the right-hand side, you can see how we pass this information in the yellow dashed line. When we consider in the bar chart that the NTC submitted by the TSOs could allow us a certain amount of the exchanges, we are limiting that amount of the exchanges according to the findings which we see from the flow-based model. And the question will be, how do we identify this limit? And more specifically, this is addressed in the following slide. If you would proceed, Lazarus, I don't know if you can hear. Thank you. So we try at the first point to analyze the net positions in this economic dispatch model for a target year 2025, so all possible range. Then we take a 99th percentile of that range for the export value, and first percentile for the import direction of these net positions, and we use that in step 3 in EVA models. On top of the TSO submitted NTCs complementary, so we are not restricting any NTCs in any directions. We consider all the NTCs available in all directions. We are just making sure that the total imports or total exports are not exceeding what would be typically expected in the flow-based model. So in this way, we are passing part of the information from the flow-based model towards the NTC-based model. And in this way, we are ensuring the consistency. in step 4, we also need to scale our identified limits for the future target years, because as we mentioned, we had the flow-based domains before only for target year 2025, and we scale them according to the NTC developments submitted by the TSOs for different target years. So we identify sort of a network development trend ratios. And at the same time, what we also identified that there are certain countries which are typically which may have a typical profile being as an exporting zone or importing zone, which means that in our analysis in the first step, we can identify that maybe a certain study zone is always importing, as for example, or always exporting, as for example. Let's stick maybe to this simpler example that we have a country which tends to export most of the time, and then our analysis in step 2 would suggest that this country cannot really import, whereas we know that there could be some extreme scenarios when countries need to rely on imports, on the coinciding outages of the generation fleet, or also on the network side. And in this case, of course, we need to make sure that we are not distorting our results in the EDA step when we use the TSO submitted NTC. So we cannot really remove completely the capability for those systems to import. So we apply minimum values, and in this extent we raise up the extreme low values slightly above, not to distort really the results. So this is in the essence how do we enhance the consistency between the EDA and AD models. So eventually we take the results of the we analyze economic dispatch results when we use the flow-based market coupling in that model. We analyze typical net positions and typical market exchanges in that model, and then we pass that information towards the EDA model as an additional information to be used complementary with the TSO submitted NTC. And in this way, we are just taking an extra step to ensure the consistency between those two models. And if we will move to the following slide, I will briefly speak about a second improvement which we have managed to achieve in frame of the ERAA study, and this is namely the network development representation. If you move further on, it's a slide just showing the current status, is that we have as a starting point a flow-based domain only for target year 2025, whereas we collect the NTCs and we know that TSO suggests that there are some network developments impacting the capabilities for the power systems to exchange electricity, and we can see this by changing NTCs in various target years. So the question is, how can we create and how can we represent this network developments for the flow-based domains themselves? So we proceed then to the next slide where we present this rather conceptually. So we have really an approach where we try to stretch a certain borders of the flow-based domains, just to make sure that we are representing these network developments. So in the step 1, we just gather really just the input data of the flow-based domains into 2025, and we also have the information about the NTCs, and you see this rather visually. At the bottom, you also see some empty rows because we have really a lot of possible projections of these flow-based domains. Just keep in mind that we have internal 19 borders within core region, which means that we can build really a lot of the possible projections. In this case, over 500,000, and we could be representing the same information with a lot of these kind of the projections, which becomes actually important in the step 2 in our analysis. Because after we get this input data of the 2025 flow-based domains and we have the NTCs, we can proceed and try to analyze the 2025 flow-based domains in light of the NTCs in a given target year. And in this case, an example is given for the 2030. So in the middle of the screen, you see that we start with the projection 1, and we try to fit in the NTC domain within the flow-based domains. And we try to identify with the blue arrows what would be an additional RAM margin needed to accommodate those NTCs. So in this case, the blue arrows are just really those pure values which we would need to really accommodate the whole NTCs, and we would be performing the same analysis for all the projections which exceed this 500,000 projection count. And for each connect, we identify a range of needed RAMs to accommodate NTC expansions, because in different projections, you may need a different value to increase the RAM to accommodate those NTCs on different borders. But this is really purely just an analysis of how much we would need to stretch the flow-based domains in various projections. The point is that we cannot simply take this information and stretch it to the maximum to fit all the NTC domains, because it would lead more to the unreasonable solution. So in step 3, we perform a reasonable flow-based domain expansion. So meaning that we don't really stretch the flow-based domains to fit all of the NTCs within the flow-based domains themselves. We leave some corners out, and we try to do that by mimicking really the NTC development submitted by the TSOs. So to maintain more on the reasonable level, we don't want to stretch these flow-based domains to the extreme, which would lead to really extreme values of possible exchanges. So we are performing this in a sense that the extension would remain a really reasonable flow-based expansion as we identify in the NTCs submitted by the TSOs. And in this case, it's more or less driven by the fact of around the 75th percentile maybe of the RAM margins which were identified in step 2. So in step 2, we have for each connect really wide range of the RAM margins, so a lot of the values. And what we noticed that around the percentile 75th of those RAM margins for each connect, we reach the level which are mimicking the NTC developments submitted by the TSOs. And if Lazarus, you would hit one slide, I would have a 1 dot pairing, and this is actually. Yes, thank you for staying here for a little bit longer. And this is just a visual example why we cannot really fit in the TSO submitted NTCs, because in some cases we may get the very extreme feasible solutions here in the far corners, which are really just unrealistically to be achieved. And this is especially true for a rather sensitive connects. If you would have a very low slope, if I can call it so, this could even extend it further in many directions, and it's just a phenomenon which we try to tackle in this step 3, not to create the flow-based domains which would be just too large and would allow too many market exchanges, which would be unreasonably high. And what I could add what I could add is just as an additional maybe remark for everyone attending. This is a well-known phenomena in frame of the long-term allocation. Also consideration within the flow-based market coupling closer to the real-time operation. So it's not something new what we have identified within the ERAA framework. It's just something what the TSO community is rather aware of, and we for sure know that we need to be very reasonable once we are expanding our flow-based domains. So this is really the point of the attention. If you move on to the next slide, I believe that I'm just finishing with the conclusions. So indeed, these are the 4 conclusions, is that the flow-based market coupling as such, it really enables the better representation of the network in the market simulation. And it really enhances the quality of the simulation results. However, at the same time, NTC market coupling, in this case, in this core region, instead of the flow-based market coupling, is sometimes really required to maintain the reasonable performance of the models and to maintain the satisfactory computational time for our needs. And at the same time, if you do that, we need to ensure reasonable coherence between the both models. And in this case, we ensure this by, first of all, using the coherent network models to compute the NTCs in our simulations and also to derive the flow-based domains. So first point is the input data starting point, and then the second point is enhancing this derived NTCs by additional limits from economic dispatch simulations using flow-based domains. So essentially, this is just passing part of the information with the flow-based models towards the models where we use only the NTCs in our simulations. Third point is that network evolution has impact on flow-based domains, which we are tackling at this very moment, and we keep in the radar for the future, also to enhance it further on. And last but not least, deriving flow-based domains from network and using it for any prospective studies looking a few years ahead is a preferable approach. And if that would be feasible, and that should be done as soon as possible. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to present these advancements.
Great presentation, Lucas. Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting developments I think we made for this year on network representation. There is quite some new elements and a lot of background work that was being done in the past weeks on this topic. So thanks a lot for shedding some light on this. And we'll have the chance to answer also any questions at the end of this webinar. So I think staying in the same family of topics, or at least linked topics, I would like to give the floor now to Zakaria El-Keloufi for a presentation on the flow factor competition and curtailment sharing, which is also a quite important element of our ERAA study. So Zakaria, the floor is yours for this presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Lazaros, and indeed, thank you, Lucas, for the insightful presentation on flow-based market coupling. So I'm Zakaria El-Keloufi, and I will be presenting today the curtailment sharing subject. I will give some background first on flow factor competition and how it's been tackled by EUFEMIA, and then I will present how curtailment sharing mechanisms will be implemented in ERAA 2023, and I will end up with a little comparison with what we have done in ERAA 2022 in terms of curtailment sharing. So first, I would like to give some background on flow factor competition. So as my Lazarus, I see some equation that is missing on this slide.
I think we might have a problem with this slide. Let me please check.
Okay, well, in the same time, I can maybe go forward. So as my colleague Lucas has presented already, the flow-based market coupling constraints are being implemented in the market modeling following the equation, which is now we can see it on the screen. It's the sum of the PTDFs multiplied by the net position that needs to be less than or equal than the RAM values. The RAM, it's the remaining margin on the critical network element and contingencies that is available for additional flows to be offered to the flow-based market coupling before the total flows on that connect leads to overloading and therefore breach the operation security. Both the RAM and the PTDS values are given in our market models, but what we need to optimize it's the net position. So clearly we can see from this equation that all bidding zones will be competing for the same capacity, which is the RAM values, but their competitive positions is determined by the zonal PTDFs. And of course, the bidding zones have different PTDFs for each hours in the market modeling tool. The problem with this is that we see two different instances that occurs in our models. The first one is that ENS can be created for net exporting countries in order to find the lowest ENS for the flow-based area as a whole. Maybe if we can, I can explain this better. This happens because when there is an ENS in the system, then this ENS is not guaranteed to be present at the bidding zone of deficits, but rather at a bidding zone such that the economical dispatch is optimized, meaning that usually that the maximum power exchange between bidding zones is enabled. Therefore, we are not protecting the countries that are net exporting from having ENS. The second problem that we see while implementing these flow-based market coupling is that countries with low flow factor, which are the countries with high PTDFs, are penalized with ENS to the benefits of countries with high flow factor, which are the countries with lower PTDFs, even if all these countries are at the same time at the maximum market price, or let's say that the countries are in simultaneous scarcities. So the ENS will be all the time being favored for countries that are being set in countries that are having a high PTDFs. So in the next slide, I will discuss how Euphemia have tackled this. So Euphemia have tackled these problems by implementing two different approaches, which are the local matching constraint and two different mechanisms, which are local matching and curtailment sharing. So maybe just since we are speaking in Euphemia, the orders, the supply and demand, they are defined at that are at the maximum price are being called as price-taking orders. So this local matching is an additional constraints that is set at the optimization problem in the master problem, setting a lower bound on the price-taking quantities. So this local matching, it aims to enforce local matching of price-taking hourly orders supplied, meaning either supply or demand with the hourly orders from the opposite sense. So we try to meet locally our demand with our local supply before doing any exchanges with other countries. That's the local matching constraint. The other part is the curtailment sharing. So I discussed earlier how this ENS is being distributed randomly in our models, and also due to flow factor competitions and the PTDFs. So in order to have a fair distribution of the ENS in the system, Euphemia have presented a term called curtailment ratios, which we can easily say that is a part of the demand that is not being met. And we try to equalize its curtailment ratios between the countries that are in scarcities. By doing so, in Euphemia, they solve the master problem and they keep the local matching constraint as a hard constraint, and then they post-process using the volume problem. They solve it using a quadratic function where they try to spread the ENS within the countries that are in scarcities using this quadratic function, which is the quadratic of the ENS divided by the part of the demand that is not being met. So these mechanisms, we try to implement both mechanisms in ERAA 2023. Lazarus, if you could go to the next slide, please. So the local matching constraint and curtailment sharing are being both implemented in our adequacy model, and we try to follow some rules for the implementation of these mechanisms. The first rule that each bidding zone is allowed to export only the share of generation capacity exceeding its internal demand. So we are preventing net exporting bidding zones to have ENS, and that's the first point that I discussed earlier. And the second point, its net importing country should primarily use internal resources to cover internal demand. So we avoid exporting countries driven by better flow factor competition. So if a country is already in scarcity, we try to, that its ENS is lower than its domestic ENS, which domestic ENS also can be defined at the demand minus the available capacity. So it's the local resources of the country before any import and exports. The rules for curtailment sharing, it's that in our model for ERAA, we define the curtailment ratio as the ENS divided by the domestic ENS. So when we try to equalize the curtailment ratios, we use the term ENS quadratic divided by the domestic ENS. And the curtailment ratios are equalized for net importers countries, meaning if I have countries in scarcities, but I have all the time local matching active, constraint active to prevent net exportant countries from sharing ENS, meaning that I share ENS only with countries that are in scarcity. In the next slide, I will show the process that we followed this year to implement curtailment sharing and local matching constraint in ERAA. This is slightly different, or let's say last year we followed a co-optimization approach, and this year we changed the approach to post-processing approach, which seems to give us the results that we would like to have. So in the base model or in the adequacy model, we have a first run of flow-based market coupling with a local matching constraint active. These local matching constraints will be modeled through conditional constraints. Once we have the model, when we are implementing these local matching constraints, it's first of all we are avoiding exporting countries from having ENS, and for importing countries we are avoiding them that their ENS is higher than the domestic ENS. So the both problems with local matching and flow factor competition and being tackled already in our base model. And once we have this model, we take the necessary output data, which will serve as an input data for the post-processing model, meaning that we build a post-processing model based on the flow-based market coupling from the base run. We take the load and the generation, and we compute the local matching constraints based on the domestic ENS, and these will serve as an input for our post-processing model. In the post-processing model, we will represent every bidding zone with the fixed generation and demand, and we leave only the flows for exchanges, meaning that I can then equalize the curtailment ratios. So I already computed the domestic ENS from the base model. Then I can equalize the curtailment ratios using full quadratic function. The next slide, please, Lazarus. In this base model, as I mentioned, we are implementing a conditional constraint to already tackle what we have problems from local matching and flow factor competition. So if we look at the global equation, we have generation minus the load, it's equal to the net position minus the ENS. If I have generation minus the load, it's positive, meaning that the region net position minus the ENS is positive. So it means that the bidding zone has no domestic ENS. If we can, the region net position, we can also translate it to the sum of the line flows. So if the condition that we set in our models, we say that if the sum of the line flows minus the ENS it's superior or equal than zeros, then the sum line flows need to be less than the generation minus the load. So in other words, if a bidding zone has no domestic ENS, then it should not have a net export that exceeds its generation minus the load, which is the local matching constraint enforced. This constraint, it's as I stated earlier, it's a conditional variable. That we set it in the model. So we have in flow-based market coupling run with the local matching constraint. This constraint is not active only when the condition is active. So we set a big value M in the model such that the exchanges are not being restricted. And once the model is the condition is being active, then the model recalculates and find and redirects the flows based on these local matching constraints. At the same thing, we do also the other part. So if the region net position minus the ENS is strictly less than zero, so if a bidding zone has ENS, then the bidding zone can be a net importers only, meaning that the sum of the line flows need to be less than or equal zero. So by that we will tackle flow factor competition as well. So that's why this year, rather than last year, we already tackled the local matching of FFC in already the base model. In the next slide, I will discuss on the post-processing model. So as I stated, the post-processing model is designed to tackle the solution of the base model with frozen generation and demand, in addition to the local matching constraint. Because if I don't take the local matching constraint, then while I'm sharing ENS, I will share it also with countries that are able to meet their demand. So that's why the local matching constraint need to be all the time active as a hard constraint for in the post-processing model, to make sure that only countries that are in scarcities can share ENS between them, based, of course, on the curtailment ratio. The data was, maybe I also spoke about it, but it's all flow-based market coupler related inputs of the base model, the load, the generation, and the local matching that is being also computed. In the next slide, we have the goals for ERA 2023. So our indicators that we use to assess the results are the ENS, the LOLE, and the domestic ENS. In the ENS distribution, our goal is that the ENS does not move from an hour to hour, because if we do co-optimization or solve the problem as a co-optimization problem and put these quadratic function already in the master problem, we will have a different optimization in the second run, which means that the ENS can move from an hour to hour. But to rather, once we are already tackling the local matching and the flow factor competition in the first run, we already kind of setting the ENS in the right places. So it means that while I'm doing the post-processing, I'm already sure where the ENS should be. So it makes more sense that, that the ENS does not move from an hour to hour. The total system ENS, of course, the increase will be really relatively very small, because at the end we are trying to minimize the ENS. Since we are using a quadratic function in the model, the solution is not the optimal one, is suboptimal. That's why we see a small increase in the final results. The ENS peak, of course, we are using a quadratic function to distribute the curtailment ratios, which means that we will try to reduce the peaks wherever it's possible. Regarding the second indicator, which is the LOLE, the total system LOLE will stay the same. So because there is no ENS moving from an hour to hour, which means then whilst I'm doing the post-processor model, wherever I have the LOLE in the system on that hour, it will stay, which means that the total system won't change. But of course, the LOLE at the bidding zone will change from bidding zone to another bidding zone based on the local matching constraint and also FFC constraints. And the latest indicator is our domestic ENS that is being computed, which should be stable between both run, because we are not doing any co-optimization. So I mean, when we do the co-optimization in scarcity, the most problem that we might have is the optimization of energy constraints technologies like hydro, like batteries, like DSR as well with constraints. So that's why once we are doing the post-processing, we are avoiding that the domestic ENS moves from or changes between the different runs, which means that while I'm sharing the ENS based on the curtailment ratios, we are doing a fair distribution of ENS. And for my last slide, I will just speak about not small, but the differences that we have between ERA 2022 and ERA 2023. So we've already presented last year, and also in the report, the implementation has been done using co-optimization. But this year we opted for let's say a post-processing approach, where we tackle already the FFC in the first run. So we will still use two different runs as last year. The only difference is that in this year we already tackled the FFC and LM in the first run. In the second run last year, because we had the quadratic function in the master problem, so it was very tricky for us, and also difficult that we have a full quadratic function. That's why we opted for a linearized quadratic function, which also works quite well. But for this year, since we are doing a post-processing model, which the model it's relatively less complex, because we fix all the generation and the load, it's only the import and export that moves. Then a full quadratic has been tested, and it shows us a great result. And also the running time it's quite relatively quickly, because we are not solving the whole optimization problem. Of course, last year the implementation of the quadratic in the second run was through decision variables that we added in the system and a bunch of constraints, which was less complex than this year, because this year we need to rebuild a model, which means every zone has demand and generation and a lot of post-processing of the data from the first run to the second run. And the last aspect is the local matching constraint. Last year, we added as a constraint. Of course, we computed the domestic ENS from the first run, and then based on that, we set it a hard constraint in the second run, where we have the local matching constraint active. But this year, the local matching will be added as a conditional constraint in the first run, and the second run it will be as a hard constraint as last year. So I think, Lazarus, that's the last slide from my side, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Indeed, thanks a lot, Zakaria, for this nice presentation and for the insights on flow factor competition and curtailment sharing. That's not an easy topic to tackle, but I believe we gave a good idea, some good insights on what we are doing. We have a lot of questions in the in Slido. Some of them we are already trying to answer in writings to ensure that we have an answer for each of the questions we receive. And I think we can now actually move to the Q&A session and start taking the answers to those questions orally. We still have enough time, I think, to tackle most of them. So I would like to ask the speakers to join me and turn on their cameras. We'll do it since we have different topics today that we tackled. I think we can take one question or two questions maybe per topic in order to make sure that we tackle all the different questions. So first question that I see in the chat relates to the EVA. It's from Robert Dills, R2B. The question is actually, do you also model further years after the last target year in multi-year EVA? So whether we consider cash flows from target years after 2033. I would like to ask Felix to answer this question.
Yeah, sure. As the presentation hopefully showed, that it's always a trade-off how to make these investment modeling more robust. In the end, of course, future cash flows after 2033 are important in the end, but on the other side, it's a trade-off. For example, other climatic years are also important. That's the reason why we've chosen this configuration. On the other hand, due to a discounting factor, of course, these future cash flows become less relevant. But in the end, yeah, it's a decision we made in order to have the most robust configuration. And in order to integrate more future years, it would definitely lead to a trade-off in reducing a number of climate years, for example. So yeah, in the end, it's a valid question, and we are still investigating on the impact of handling the future years. For example, setting the last year as a proxy for the whole lifespan of investment decisions is one option we're investigating, or selecting just the average over the whole horizon as a proxy for the years after. But yeah, it's a good point. Yeah.
Thanks, Felix, for that. I would stay with you for another question on EVA. Which one? I mean, you already provided a short answer in writing, but I think it might deserve some more insights here. It's about the target years, whether we actually simulate them in a single calculation.
Yeah, actually, we are trying to get everything run within one simulation. So full horizon, all 4 target years and all climatic years in one simulation step. As we see that this is not possible in an hourly resolution, there are different options I presented. But it's still more or less the overall target is to have it in one simulation. So it could be that we end up with 2 steps in a rolling horizon approach, but then it would mean that we have 3 target years and 3 climatic years within one step. So it's a bit reduced foresight due to computational limitation.
Thanks, Felix. I think we can now switch to the energy islands. We have also 2 questions on this topic. I would like to ask Antonio for an answer on the first one. So are the energy islands actually modeled as offshore bidding zones or as hybrid interconnectors?
Thanks, Lazarus. So maybe you can show slide 31 to better answer this one. But in a nutshell, we are doing both things. So we model offshore bidding zones that are interconnected among them. It's actually slide 13, your slide set, sorry. So we are modeling indeed offshore bidding zones, but then they are interconnected through this hybrid interconnection. And what do we mean by hybrid interconnection? So interconnections that connect this offshore bidding zone both in between themselves, let's say in between different offshore bidding zones, and also radially towards shore. So basically we are modeling offshore bidding zones with hybrid interconnections.
Thanks, Antonio. There is another question. I think it's also relevant, so maybe you can also take this one as well. So for the offshore modeling, do you consider a dedicated offshore bidding zone as the offshore farm? As the offshore farm could be connected to more than one price zones, as seen from the map.
Yeah, so we are, as we do with any other power plant in ERAA, we are not modeling the specific interconnection of the individual power plant, but rather we model interconnections in between bidding zones. So this applies also for these questions. We do not model specific interconnections of the offshore power plant, but rather the interconnection of the whole hub with another hub or with shore, as I explained in the answer to the other question.
Thanks, Antonio. We can have some questions now on network representation, and there I would like to ask Lucas. There is a question on whether flow-based domains should separately calculate it for its target year to avoid relying on certain assumptions.
So yeah, thank you, Lazarus. Indeed, this is what we see as the best solution. Of course, we have to always take into account the possible implications and the time required to process all this data, compute it, and the time frame also available for European resource adequacy assessment. So I just want to be very clear is that the work and task itself is rather a complex task, as we have a huge continental area in Europe. It's one of the largest working power systems so far. So everything takes a lot of time, and running the simulations and analysis on this parameter is rather time consuming. So yes, this is what we see as the best solution, and this is what we are aiming for. And the only thing is just to understand even ourselves what is reasonable to achieve in the timeframes available for European resource adequacy assessments.
Thanks, Lucas. I would like to take a second question on this topic, and I will first prioritize here the questions asked with a name. So I will go to the question of Thomas. The expansion of flow-based domains to fit NTC seems to pose the same mathematical problem as the inclusion of LTA in the day-ahead capacity calculation. Have you considered the solution proposed there? Is this something you're familiar, Lucas?
Right. So first of all, it's very great to see Thomas joining us. So hello, Thomas, because Thomas is an ex-colleague with whom we have worked from different sections, but it was really interesting years as well to work with him, and it's very nice to see that people still remain in touch with our activities. And then I would proceed maybe to answering the question. It's something what we have briefly discussed, but all of the ideas are, of course, very novel ones, and the one ballast approach, what Thomas also mentioned, it's one of those as well. Long story short, I would say is that our now objective was to take our solid flow-based domains, which we have in 2025, and expand it according to the network evolutions which we identified together with the TSOs from the NTC submitted for our studies. And rather not to really try to create an approximate flow-based domain between the NTC submitted by them and our solid foundation. So I see this rather like a conceptual. Our objective was really to expand the existing flow-based domains according to the network evolutions, which we see, rather than approximating and having a hybrid flow-based domains between the 2025 flow-based domains and some NTCs in the future years. I hope, Thomas, that this really answers your question.
Thanks, Lucas. Of course, we are always happy to engage bilaterally with stakeholders. So feel free to get back to us after this call if you still have unanswered questions. Then I would move to the next point. Also, I would like to mention that if any of the other speakers want to comment on any of the questions that we are tackling, feel free to do that. So I will take a first question on curtailment sharing. So this will be directed to Zakaria. The question is, how do you ensure that the additional hours of scarcity due to curtailment sharing in the ED also correspond to hours of high prices across all affected zones in the EVA?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just speaking about the curtailment chain, so there is no local matching on the EVA model. So because it's an NTC-based model, the local matching and curtailment chain are really on the adequacy parts. But we are planning to make some analysis regarding the prices, the high prices in EVA, and also on adequacy. I mean, later on in the report, we will give more analysis regarding that.
Thanks, Zakaria. I'm looking now for a second question on the topic. I see one from Tamas. Maybe this time I will take the question actually of Simon, just for diversity of questionnaires. So as far as I understand, Simon says you solve. I hope you can see also the question, Zakaria, because there are some questions. Okay. So minimize the square of ENS divided by DNS, but for equalizing, you would need to solve min-max. The result might be equivalent, says Simon. I hope that
I already actually answered on it, because there's a bit of confusion there. It's the ENS quadratic divided by the domestic ENS, because otherwise it does not make any sense to have ENS divided by the domestic ENS all quadratic. So the ENS quadratic divided by the domestic ENS, that's what we try to solve to equalize the curtailment ratios.
Great. Then let's go back to the question of Tamas. What is the quantitative impact of the different definition of curtailment ratios than EFIMIA and the different allocation objective?
Maybe I can answer the first part on it. So in EFIMIA, indeed, they use the demand, but it's not. We should not take it as explicitly as the demand is, because it's really the part of the demand that is not being met. But in our adequacy model, since we want to try to do fair distribution, if I use the total demand, if I have countries like Germany next to Netherlands or Malta with smaller demand, and I try to equalize the curtailment ratio, I might not even reduce the ENS. So that's why using the demand as total demand of country as curtailment ratios to equalize the ENS, it's not. We don't see it as the fair distribution that we need to achieve here. That's why we take the parameter domestic ENS, which gives more logic to the distribution and also the fairness of the distribution of the curtailment ratios within the countries.
Thanks, Zakaria. I think we can go back now to the EVA topics. We have a question there from Robert Deals, which is, do you also model? No, I think we answered that. Yes. So a question from an anonymous person. So it seems you are testing different approaches to streamline EVA. How will you select the preferred approach this year? So will it be based on computational efforts or based on KPIs to quality, consistency? This is the question.
Yeah, thanks. Good, very good question. Yeah, the computational resources are limiting in the end, so that's the field where we can move in, and there are different KPIs, targets to reach. On the one hand side, it's the robustness of the investment decision, more foresight, as already mentioned, more climatic years lead to a higher robustness of these investment decisions. That's on the one hand, and the other thing is consistency between EVA and economic dispatch. So more climatic years in the EVA step, of course, leads to more consistency between EVA and economic dispatch. So yeah, that's basically the trade-off right here. But these two areas are what we are targeting for.
Thanks. I'm trying to see here, there are some questions that are answered already in writing. For example, the one of Georg I see is already answered. So maybe you can also comment, Felix, on the question on the composition techniques to solve EVA.
Yes, the temporal decomposition was something I just showed. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, please go on.
Yeah. So the question was like, are there any decomposition? Do we consider any decompositions methods? And basically, the temporal decomposition is one that we applied. Another, way of reducing simulation time is aggregating units. That's also what we're doing in the EVA step with the same techno-economical parameters. The units are being aggregated. The other methods like benders and so on, or regional decomposition, is something, we investigated, we tested, we checked, but in the end, also due to literature, and I would be very happy if you have anything, our finding was that they cannot really be applied and lead to much increase in in performance and reduction of simulation time. So happy to interact.
Yes, thanks, Felix. Definitely, we are happy to receive any proposals or any concrete solutions on that. So we can move to another question related to network representation. This was actually posted at the beginning of the workshop, so it might have been answered already by the presentation of Lucas, but I can give the floor to Lucas here for this one as well. So the question is, I would like to know what proxy was used for the network expansion modeling.
Right. So indeed, I briefly touched during the presentation, but it's never too much, I guess, to repeat. So we build the proxy of the network development according to the TSO submitted NTCs. So they have submitted the NTCs, and by the trends delivered by them through those NTCs, we can identify the proxy of the network development. So this is really our foundation of the data to estimate the network development trends. And it was used in both cases to scale up the NTC limits for the enhanced consistency between economic dispatch and the EVA, and also for the flow-based domain expansions.
Thanks, Lucas. Since you are already talking, I will give another question to you. So, what is the factor for the flow-based extension adjustment in step 3 that you presented? Is this a constant factor for each border or a border-dependent factor?
Yeah. So. It's not a simple answer because with the flow-based domains, we don't have such kind of concept as the physical borders itself. So, and we typically try just to avoid discussions on the border. So we always speak about the flow-based domain representation in a form of the net position of each of the bidding zones. So, so it's not that simple to answer it technically super correct now. So I'm just trying actually to see in a written form that it will help me a little bit to answer the question. But okay, I cannot now find it very quickly.
We can come back to this later on. Indeed, it has since we marked it as answered, it actually disappeared. But I will bring it back, and then you can take it in a second round.
Yeah, thank you. Because the answer was just on my lips. It just ran away. So I would just refer to this. Okay, thank you.
So let me see what we have left. There are still some questions. There is a general question on the adequacy metrics and how the adequacy metrics and how can be affected by the different assumptions in DVA and DD. Maybe this is a good question to get some comments from Marlene and Daniel on a higher level, since this has been also the topic of discussions between ENTSO-E and Acer. Marlene, would you like to go first with a comment on this one?
Yes, Lazarus, thank you. I mean, from the starting, both modules were intended for two different purposes. So basically, this is where we started when implementing a methodology. We figured out over the implementation phase that the single step in a very first attempt is not that easily feasible. And this is actually the status where we are right now, and which was a big criticism point, as you also saw in the feedback from Acer on the ERAA 2022 product. And that's why in these recent weeks and months, we took actions in order to strive towards increased consistency. And this is what we listed in today's webinar, the actions to bring those two models closer at a certain point in time. And I let it to Daniel to also put the comment on it.
Yeah, indeed. So in the absence of an integrated model, so one-step modeling, a robust ERA should ensure consistency of between the two modules, consistency of revenues. And so one example for that, because the person asked for an example, could be the cross-zonal capacity. So one of the slides that I brought, and on a more intuitive level, if there was a more cross-zonal capacity provided in the investment module, than in the economic dispatch module, then it could lead to maybe less investment. It could work as a disincentive to investment in other resources such as generation. But at the same time, it could work towards seeing more risk in the economic dispatch where the cross-zonal capacities are lower. So they could have different effects in the two module, and at the end influencing the LOLI results. So it's just an intuitive example, but in general, I repeat that to us it stands to reason to have the same assumptions and the same implementation choices in the two modules, in the lack of a single integrated model, and we work towards that this year.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Marlene, for the answer. I think there has been quite some effort towards this direction in this era. I'm checking now the remaining of the questions to identify which is the most relevant to take. There is a question on EVA, which states calculating certain years each independently on its own by an integrated cost minimization of dispatch and invest, and then using a heuristic overall calculated years that evaluates whether plants should be disinvested or invested. It's not the question is not very clear to me. I don't know, Felix, if you already have a comment, but maybe we can ask the person that wrote it to actually follow up with a bit of clarification. It's an anonymous, so I can also not see who posted it.
Yeah, this would be, so if it's an alternative approach as a proposal, Yeah, I think we could think about this in the end. Yeah, I would be happy to get a bit more details. I think what
Okay.
we are running, just to clarify, is like the first part of this question. So we are running a full integrated cost minimization and dispatch and yeah, investment model. There's no heuristic afterwards.
Thanks for the comment. Maybe in that case, since you are already speaking, I can ask you for a short comment on the first question that we have with respect to upvotes. It's not really relevant to the presentation we had today, but maybe we can make a short comment also on that, on the day-ahead price cap, and how how EVA is actually positioned with respect to day-ahead market or to the electricity market in general.
Yeah. I think that's also a very good question. We do have different price caps on different markets. So in the end, we decided to take the market with the highest liquidity, and that's the day-ahead market, and that's the price cap and the price cap rules we are applying to our models. Of course, if you take another price cap, you get other results. Higher price caps leads to higher, to a better adequacy, higher dimensioned power plant fleet. But in the end, seeing the market situation and the different markets as they are, the highest liquidity is in the day-ahead market, and therefore we take this one.
Thanks for the comment, Felix. Next, I would ask a question to Lucas or maybe Zakaria. Please feel free if you want to take this one. So it's how do you estimate or calculate the PTDF matrix in a future scenario where we cannot have an accurate forecast of the network state, and how the network expansion is considered in the calculation?
Right. That's probably more for me on the network development representation, right? So actually, we disregarded the impact of the changes of the PTDFs in our expansion. We just try to increase the RAM values, and in this way, we expanded our flow-based domains. And this is partially due to the fact that like continental Europe, about the region about we are speaking of, it's quite well interconnected, and it's quite a mesh system. And we could estimate that there is an impact, of course, on the PTDFs once the network develops. But we could also discuss that. In most of the cases, the impact on the PTDFs are not the most prominent, and we are more speaking on the, let's say, possibility to expand the area of the flow-based domain. So for this moment, we are not, but of course, the best and the target solutions could be really just to compute the flow-based domains for every single target year based on the network models for every single target year. And in this case, we would also see the impact on the PTDFs themselves. And I hope that this also answers the question. And Lazarus, if you would like to, I could also go back to the previous question.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, because I managed to find, and I hope that it's not disappearing. So the question was really on the so the question was, what is the factor for the flow-based extension adjustment in step 3? Is this constant factor for each border or a border dependent factor? So here I would say that it is we didn't want it to really differentiate it from let's say not the border, but from the connect perspective. So we try to maintain in a more or less the same level. However, as I told you, that we perform the analysis on the NTC border side just to try to fit the flow-based domains within the NTC domains within the flow-based domains. expanded reasonably, and then we were checking basically how much of the net position metric of the flow-based domain changes from the initial flow-based domain net position metric, and we try to also compare with the evolution of the net position limit from the submitted NTC. So, for instance, if we see that countries could import roughly, 10% more between the 2 years using the NTCs, we were aiming at similar results, also looking at the flow-based domains themselves. So, in this way, we try to really achieve more or less the coherent approach for the flow-based domain expansion. So, it was a rather for each individual connect, we try to remain rather on a consistent factor, but at the same time we were checking that these KPI changes remain coherent between the NTC and the flow-based domains.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks for coming back to this and answering. I would also like to clarify, to help us organize a bit the questions. We have archived some of the questions that included our written replies, so we now brought them back for the people that want to actually see the answers. Sorry for that. Then I would need to check what are the remaining questions. There are, I think, 2 more questions. One, both actually are for Simon Tiedemanns. Also, happy to see Simon being actively involved in this webinar. Very well appreciated your feedback always in our study and the collaboration. So maybe, I don't know if Felix, you want to have a comment on the first one, which is on most, it says most developments target the calculation of point estimates. What are the main uncertainties you would like to know, and are there any barriers that prevent it?
Yeah, great question. So this, as I interpreted it, this would say, what more do you want to find in the models, and what more do you want to model? And basically, as you see, we have very much and enough to do in fulfilling regulation. But apart from that, I think more scenarios in terms of fuel prices, CO2 prices, and so on. Would be something as an energy system modeler would find interesting, and to see how, for example, investment candidates change and how the viability of the plans change, and also what this means in terms of adequacy. And another thing to investigate would also be to have different scenarios in terms of more Monte Carlo dimensions in the end. But yeah, this is all something that is limited by regulation, and in the end there's enough to do and to fulfill this regulation as it is.
Thanks for the comment, Felix, and we are always happy to engage after this. So I would also leave the last question, since we don't have our expert here to answer this, so we can take this actually with Simon bilaterally. Thanks for your understanding. So I think that's it. We answered all questions, so it was quite good that we had enough time to do so, and I hope that you are covered and you now understand better also the presentations. Before closing the call, I would like to also give the opportunity to the speakers if you want to add any last remarks, or if you have any other comments, please feel free to do so. In case there are no other comments, then I would close this webinar just showing the timeline with our interactions with stakeholders and the public. So this was the last part of the two-part webinar on methodological insights. We also had one at the beginning of the process with the preliminary input data and the call for evidence. And you can expect soon to find on our website the post-consultation dataset, which will include, as I mentioned earlier, the price cap estimations. Then we are running through the most intense period with respect to simulations and results analysis. Everyone is busy with that at ENTSO-E. It will be a very busy summer, and then we will come back to you in November with our publication. Which will be followed as always by a webinar on the results and the consultation where we will be happy to receive your feedback on this edition of ERAA as well. With this timeline, I would like to close this webinar, to thank first of all the speakers for the very insightful presentations and for tackling all the answers, and then also thank all the audience for joining and being quite active in the Q&A. And feel free, as I mentioned a couple of times, feel free to send us your questions also before, after this webinar, and we can engage with you bilaterally to help you understand better our products. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining, and I wish you a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.